In this video, we'll be taking apart the Motorola Signature. If you're interested in seeing more videos like this, make sure you subscribe and click on notification bell so you'll be notified once I upload a new video. Also, if you need any tools, there are links in the description. We'll start off by removing the SIM tray. Looking at the SIM tray, we see a red rubber gasket around the opening. Now heat needs to be applied to the back plate using either a hairdryer or a heat gun to loosen up the adhesive underneath, and then a pry tool can be used to pry the back plate off. I prefer to use a hairdryer since there's less of a chance of damaging any of the components inside by overheating them. Here's a better look at the twill texture backplate. The glass camera lens covers can be replaced by applying heat and prying them off, so you won't have to take apart the phone to replace those. Looking at the other side, we see the small board which has the LED flash, as well as the 3-in-1 light sensor. There are now 15 Phillips screws which need to be removed, one of which is underneath the graphite film. Taking a look at the top plastic motherboard cover, we see the NFC antenna located here, as well as the antenna lines drawn on the plastic cover which are the light gray color lines. The wireless charging coil is located in the center, and there's graphite film to help transfer heat. Looking at the other side, we see the large speaker on top, which is more of a premium speaker compared to standard earpiece speakers which you see in most Motorola phones. So with the motherboard cover removed, we see more of a different and complex design when it comes to the motherboard compared to that of what we're used to seeing with most other Motorola phones. We can see that this is a premium level device with overall design, the large camera, and periscope telephoto lens. There are two battery cables which need to be disconnected from the main board, of which one has some copper film over it which needs to be peeled off, and the other one with some protective film which also needs to be peeled off. The battery cables can now be disconnected, followed by the rest of the cables. The coaxial cables on the bottom right side of the board can be disconnected by just popping them off. The 50 megapixel front-facing camera, which has a Sony Lydia 500 sensor, is glued in place, so we will need to disconnect the flex cable for the front-facing camera from the main board prior to lifting up and removing the main board. Taking a look at the main board, we see the 50 megapixel primary camera, which has a Sony Lydia 828 sensor, the 50 megapixel ultra-wide lens, as well as a 50 megapixel periscope telephoto lens, which incorporates a Sony Lydia 600 sensor. The periscope telephoto lens and the primary camera have OIS or optical image stabilization. There's a secondary microphone on the top corner, an additional microphone behind the secondary board where this hole is, which picks up sound from the back of the phone, in between the camera lens on the camera bezel, and a thermal pad over here where the flashboard sits over to help transfer heat when the LED flash is on. Now here's where it gets a bit more interesting. Motorola is using a new copper mesh film to help transfer heat, which is a first in smartphones. This is in addition to their liquid metal cooling compound. Taking a closer look, we can see through the mesh copper film to where the RAM and processor are. Once the copper mesh film has been peeled back, we have a better look at the liquid metal thermal compound, which is in the center portion, surrounded by thermal paste on the outer portion. Both the thermal paste and the liquid metal thermal compound are seated over the LPDDR5X RAM, which is seated over the Snapdragon 8 Gen 5 processor. Now, one thing which hasn't changed when it comes to Motorola is the method in prying off the battery. They still haven't incorporated a pull pouch or a pull tab to help you pry the battery off. So we will need to use some isopropyl alcohol and apply it to the sides of the battery and let it sit for about 30 seconds to a minute so it eats away at the adhesive underneath, making it easier to pry it off. This is the 5200 mAh silicon carbon incorporated lithium ion battery. Once the subboard cover is removed, we see the flex cable for the screen which is connected to the subboard, as well as this flex cable assembly which connects the main board to the subboard. So if you needed to replace the screen, you'd have to remove the back plate, the screws on the bottom cover and the cover itself, disconnect the cables from the subboard and remove the subboard, giving you access to the screen cable, at which point you'd heat up the front of the phone where the screen is to loosen up the adhesive underneath, pry the old screen off, apply new adhesive and reapply the new screen, making sure you run the flex cable back to the opening in the mid-frame, and reassemble the phone. There's a single Phillips screw which is holding on the subboard. Looking at the subboard, we see the charger port with the red rubber gasket around it, and the primary microphone is located underneath this covered shield. The SIM reader is located on the other side. The vibrator motor is located here, which is held down with some adhesive, and the same goes to the bottom speaker. Once the flex cable assembly has been peeled back, we see a large vapor chamber which runs underneath the battery, as well as the entire motherboard. There is also some aluminum heat transfer film, which is seated in between the vapor chamber and camera assembly. One more thing to note, there's a cutout in the frame underneath the primary camera, the periscope telephoto lens, as well as where the processor is, giving a direct contact between those components and the vapor chamber to better help transfer heat. The flex cable for the volume keys and power buttons located here, which is routed to an opening in the mid-frame, which is one thing I don't like about the design, since Motorola tends to do this with a lot of their phones, which makes it much more difficult when you have to replace that flex cable, since it also requires prying the screen off, which does pose a high chance of damaging a working screen. The same goes for the flex cable on the other side for the other button. When it comes to this phone, if you're to accidentally insert a SIM ejector tool in the wrong hole, you won't need to worry since both the microphone filters and the microphones themselves are seated above the holes so they wouldn't get damaged. And finally, the front ambient light and proximity sensor board is located here, which is held down with some adhesive. For the repairability score on this phone, I give it a 6.5 out of 10. The battery doesn't have a pull pouch or pull tab to help you pry it off. However, the adhesive underneath it isn't that strong, so with some isopropyl alcohol, it can easily be pried off. Also, the front-facing camera is glued in place, so it will be a bit more difficult prying that off to replace it. Now it's time to put the phone back together. Once everything's back in place, apply new adhesive and reapply the back cover. Flip over the phone, power it on, and you're done. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.